Okay. So, welcome everybody to this interesting topic. Aaron, we just decided you're the chair.
Oh yeah, okay, fine.
You're the chair because you were only the chair.
Oh, right.
So you have this role now.
Oh, okay. Right. Now, okay, guys.
You're the chair's person.
You're the chair. So welcome everybody. We're talking about requisite variety today. And the first question I would like to ask is, what is requisite variety?
Yes, good. Who does know? Who has heard of it before? First of all, you have maybe not heard of it. Some cyberneticians. Some cyberneticians here. It's from cybernetics, right? Cybernetics is the science of control and governance of man and the machine, as Norbert Wiener wrote down in 1947. Cybernetics is a system to govern, to steer with feedback. Feedback is information. Negative is feedback and positive feedback. Now, feedback, of course, is a very important part because everything in nature works with feedback mechanisms. Social systems, natural systems, but also automated mechanistic systems also have feedback principles. For example, a thermostat to regulate the temperature works with feedback, right? Because when it measures a temperature that goes above their set limits, it will be changing the heater or it's going to turn on the air conditioning, right?
So can I ask why Alan is shaking his head? Because I'm always observing.
Yeah, because actually I think the whole idea of feedback is based on a fallacy. It's based on the notion of a time delay between input and output, and that involves a boundary issue. And in many situations, we're looking at a there is a synchrony between input and outputs, but it's all to do. So essentially, one way I can say this is, when I breathe in, my outside similarly breathes out, and when I breathe out, my outside simultaneously breathes in. So you're actually looking at a simultaneous relationship that is going on. If you think about the way that a river relates with its landscape, attunes with its landscape, then essentially the river both shapes and is simultaneously shaped by the landscape it is flowing through. So as soon as you have a deep understanding of simultaneity and natural flow, in receptive responsive relationship, then the idea of feedback, particularly as it is commonly represented mathematically in nonlinear systems theory, is actually to some extent an artifact. And I'm not sort of disputing it in very strong ways, but I'm just recognizing that it's the way humans have taught ourselves to think, is in sequence, in time sequence, and we're not so good perhaps at thinking in terms of synchronicity, and that has to do, of course,
we go way. Hold on. Not too fast, Alan.
But it has to do, but it has to do with natural inclusion.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't see that those are two opposite opinions.
No, but
no, they're not opposite.
I think they're complementary, and they show a different perspective of the same thing, which I think it's very important to talk about requisite variety. Maybe
let's just
now another perspective of Ed, maybe a more social perspective.
We may be the only people in 8 billion people who are having this conversation right now, and I think that matters. And in exchange, the exchange of our ideas, and to a certain extent our emotions, it fits into this thing in some manner. And yeah, I get the science and I get the mechanics of it. I can see how both of those. I think I see how we are as human beings, stimulus response beings. You know, we do something and we get a response. Sometimes it's synchronous, sometimes it's not. I think all those things are. The question is, how do we understand ourselves in the context of that? That requisite variety?
Variety, yeah. Well,
and synchronicity.
Shall I just say what the basics for requisite variety are, because I think that maybe clarifies, because we don't want to deviate too far into synchronicity and non-linearity because it's too complex for today, I think. So anyway, so law of requisite variety. It says, and Ross Ashby wrote this, a situation can only be controlled if the variety of the controller matches the variety of the situation to be controlled. What does it mean?
May I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
What is variety?
I will explain. I will variety. Yeah, that's gonna next step, Ed. Okay, hold on.
Next class. Will this be on the final exam? So
the variety of a system or a situation or even a operation, and I'm using this for my oil and gas operations. So okay, so if we have for example, a health and safety situation, right? Externally and internally, we have health and safety issues. We can then build the variety to absorb the variety that we envisage and expect. For example, you build a system that has tools, knowledge, information, equipment, health and safety protection stuff, and so on, that will absorb the variety that was expected. This is how that works. So I can read it like this. For example, hold on, I'll just read from my paper here. So it means, for example, that we can build information, feedback is a capacity, requisite variety is the capacity of a system to respond to risk. For example, a society generates tremendous variety and tries to control in its own way through checklists, regulation, and laws. Human variety, environmental variety, and social variety, like regulatory variety, change all the time and that cannot be controlled. Therefore, a living system, any organization, a system, needs to maintain and develop an internal requisite variety to be able to absorb, meaning counterbalance or mitigate, outside variety. This means to have the people with the combined knowledge, experience, expertise, influence, tools, equipment to do so. Okay,
Thank you.
So
now I want
really
to,
in a nutshell.
Wonderful. So I want to ask Adam, because he has to leave. I know I have some inside knowledge. Adam has to leave in 30 minutes. And I want to ask his perspective, because it was actually a cartoon that that Adam, John Flack, and Fred made that inspired me to actually try to tackle this topic. So Adam, please.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, because I wasn't here for it? I feel like
what is requisite variety?
What is requisite variety?
And bring your kind of, we have different viewpoints already. Alan was adding, Aaron was explaining it in the perfect system thinkery sense, I would say, as a control mechanism, and Alan was adding synchronicity. So now you can add maybe simplicity.
Okay, so does everybody accept that a viable system must have requisite variety? Is that, or do we agree that?
Yeah.
Does anybody disagree with that?
Aye.
Okay, cool. So every organization has to obey Ashby's law of requisite variety, or it ceases to exist. It's very simple. If a human body can't withstand the temperature range of the country it lives in, it's not viable. So if your body could only stand a temperature range of 2 degrees, you wouldn't survive on the planet. So in Switzerland, the temperature ranges between -20 and +40. So there's a 60-degree range of temperatures, and obviously your body's got to be able to cope with that, even with clothes, right? So you have to have the ability to change your chemistry and physiology to deal with whatever the environment is throwing at you. The same with every organization. If an organization lives in a regulatory framework and the regulatory framework changes because a new government turns up and it can't adapt to that change, then it will die. It becomes illegal, and it does. Pretty much what you were thinking? That answer the question?
Thank you.
Oh.
Yes, I find it's a very clear description, and it simplifies the vision so that everybody now understands it. Who wants to talk next? Nathan.
Actually, I'm just learning this term, so
Okay, if you're learning this term, then please ask the question.
maybe partly understand it.
Let's talk about the practical applications that we have in daily life, for example, right? Actually, what I've been studying, and I'm doing, my PhD on this at the moment. So it's really, I'm going to have a lot deeper maybe than necessary, but just for simplicity reasons, it's very handy to have this idea of requisite variety, because you can then, imagine a situation, you want to do a project, you want to do an operation somewhere, you want to build something, you want to create something, and then you say, okay, what is the variety, the information, in fact, that is needed to make this thing function? The viability, just as Adam says, viability of a system. So it's okay, now we can build the variety that is needed to create this thing or system, whatever. So requisite variety, I see it like that. It's like a list of things you need to build or create something that can become and stay viable. And that you can apply this to everything, in finance, in government, in industries, in manufacturing, everything. So a lot of stuff that I find, and my research goal is to determine the criteria for non-harmful functionality of man-made systems. So when I use requisite variety, I can therefore use that system to list the criteria that will make it viable, that will make the functionality and determine the functionality of the things we, man, create.
So my question is, you said you create it, but it's a viable system, which means it's a living system, and we're not creating life. So
no, it's a learning, adaptive, of course, system that needs to pick up. And we go back to feedback. Feedback, the correcting feedback. Negative feedback is correcting feedback, while positive feedback is enforcing or is strengthening feedback, which makes things unstable. So always allowing for negative feedback, which corrects the process, because we are talking about dynamics here. Nothing is really finished. But we can at least, create and list the stuff that we need to build something that we have to create the probability pattern of viability, because we have to be careful. And my professor says, cannot say fact, you have to say probability. So probability patterns of viability can be aided by this law of requisite variety.
Okay. So Nathan doesn't know the topic yet. So I'm interested in his perspective and his questions. He needs to understand it better.
This is not entirely fair. I've only started to have my first coffee of the morning.
Oh, sorry. But can you talk? Or am I traumatizing you?
No, you're not traumatizing me. I'm starting the day with a little trauma related to something else. So I'm distracted by that.
Did you find that you follow the logic, Nathan?
Somewhat. I had a screen a few minutes ago that gave me a couple of different short definitions, and to the extent that I understood it seemed kind of trivial. I mean, at least in real life. right? Probably useful for scientists describing something theoretically, but so far it hasn't clicked for me.
Well,
Okay, let me give you an example about business, because that's my field, right?
Yeah.
So in business, we have a call center, and the call center takes calls about stuff, about their business, right? And certain calls are about customer service, and certain calls are about billing, and certain calls are about the device or the thing that they own or the whatever, right? Those are not the different support calls. And so what the business decides to do, like all businesses, is they're going to make efficiencies. So they say that these people who take the calls, they leave really quickly. They don't stay long, right? So we have 30% turnover in a call center is normal. And therefore, what we do is we only train them in one thing, because we haven't got time to train them in anything else. So each person who takes a call can only take a call about one thing. And then what we do in the call center is we say, well, we get the customer to route themselves by saying, well, press 1 to do this, press 2 to do this, press 3 to do this. So the customer could be calling about anything, and the business says, we'll get the customers to stream themselves to end up talking to the right person. If I ask people, all people, when you go to a call center, do you follow that, or do you press any number just to talk to somebody? And we've all done that, right? Just press any number, right? And you end up talking to the wrong guy who knows nothing about your thing, and therefore you have to be handed off. The call center lacks the requisite variety. And the way they try and manage that is by creating a filter to attenuate the variety, reduce the variety. Unfortunately for them, people are purposeful and do what the hell they want. So you end up with.
Well, and also, if you give people 18 options, some number of customers will come in and desperately need number 19.
Exactly,
And
and also,
20.
and this is why virtual assistants don't work with AI, right? Because they've got only a set number of answers, and you've always got the different question. Also, people generally want to call about 3 things, right? I only call the call center when I've got like 3 queries, because I'm not going to sit in the queue for hours, and I just, so when it becomes unbearable that I've got all these issues, right? I want to talk about my bill, about my handset, about how do I do this, and that's 3 different people with 3 different call queues.
It turns out that IVRs are a plot, an anti-business plot, to ensure that customers are maximally upset before they actually talk to an agent.
Well, what happens is that the call center lacks the requisite variety, because management have made an efficiency which is about linearity, not a systemic view of the world. So it lacks the requisite variety because they removed it.
Yeah.
So all businesses like that, with this mechanistic view of the world, where they go, we'll manage our inputs and turn it into an output. Forget they're not manufacturing something where everything is every input is great tolerance around it.
Yeah.
It could be anything. So therefore you have to have the ability to deal with anything. That's how you apply it in reality. That's why business.
So if you're dealing with people having a finite list of things you can do, we'll always hit the limit at some point.
Right. Lack the requisite variety. There you go. Hope that helped.
Yeah, I think so. I think so that the idea of cybernetics is Heinz von First is that you can maximize your requisite variety or information by asking a maximum number of questions. Always. So that is really this is really what it's all about. I think maximum information gives maximum control, and this is also related to physics. Physical systems. Information is physical, as Shannon and some others say. And therefore, if you have an information deficit, you also have an energy deficit, which means that the functionality is compromised. So this is a really important finding I find in my research. So relation between energy and information, therefore, will maximize, if we have all the information, the functionality. So you see, requisite variety is part of that information. Can't make it any simpler than that, which is actually energy. So that is an important, I think, finding, because a lot of stuff they think, we can delete the information because we don't need it, or we want to ignore it, suppress it. But therefore, the functionality will become compromised, will be less because the energy to do work will be missing. This is a law of physics. And therefore, nothing works like Cat Weasel says in our universe, right?
So does anyone have an idea, after having those explanations, why it is important to have polymaths in the loop concerning
Yes.
Ed and then Alan?
As I hear you describe these various ways of looking at requisite variety, it seems like it's a form of creating order in a complex system that could easily become disordered without some way of managing the system itself. And requisite, I take as to be the requirement, which is a form of limitation upon the system so that it is able to function. But if there is no limitation, then it can grow without. I mean, I look at from my experience as a organizational consultant, and working with organizations where I've watched the administrative class within those organizations grow, when the people who are actually the productive members of the business or the school or whatever it may be have not grown in numbers, and so the real value is, say if it's a university or the professors, the ones that interact with the students, but that's not where the growth has been. It's been at the administrative level, and that becomes a problem. Kind of requisite variety becomes a problem because the system no longer serves its purpose. It serves the need to keep the requisite variety ordered, and so the question that comes to me is requisite variety something that human beings impose upon a system, or is it something that the system imposes upon itself?
Good question. I think maybe Adam, Stafford Bird, he said this posy with, the purpose of a system is what it does, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, and I think that is maybe an answer to add to, a system becomes its own system, as you say, to serve its own purposes. But what are the purposes? If it's the growth for themselves, or for example, a government that is growing without any, restrictions, limitations for the quality of the system. So the quality and the usefulness and the functionality of that system.
Very often, one of the main goals of systems is just self-perpetuation.
Right, Carl, sorry. Yeah, the self-perpetuation. Therefore, these systems grow, and therefore, the negative feedback, the correcting information, which is not really used, because they want to grow and ignore then the correcting feedback that should limit that growth. So only positive feedback is used, and then the system get out of control. And you can see that worldwide everywhere.
Maybe Carlos, can you elaborate further on this and taking requisite variety and polymath, and elaborate on that?
Just start by saying that my understanding of requisite variety is very, very nebulous. I'd heard of the topic before today, but I've learned more today than I had in the past. So that's a starting point. The second, this small observation I just made, that any kind of system has usually, because it's constituted of human elements, the ones we're talking about right now at least, they tend to self-perpetuate if they can, because people's livelihoods are usually implicated. Obviously, requisite variety is not just applicable in human organizations, it goes all over the place, but I cannot conceptualize that yet. So I'm restraining myself to this use case. The example that came to my mind when this happened, and I'm sorry if any of you feel offended by this comment, was organized religion. In my mind, that's what came first. there was a purpose. It has been or not fulfilled, and quite clearly at some points in time, it exceeded the reason for why it existed historically. So that was the image I had. Why are polymaths required in situations like this? And I'm going to come back to Adam's example of the call center, where he said that the 30% turnover of personnel was an identified issue, and each one was trained in one task only, and then you needed a filter. Well, taking the problem the other way around, if we manage to have personnel trained in multiple questions that will be asked, or the 19th question that is not on the menu that might pop up, even if they don't know, they will be able at least to connect dots, and if necessary, send to a second level of triage. But so the problem wouldn't be create that filter first, but train the people to recognize patterns and to recognize what their clients are first asking for. And this is not a polymath's job to be doing this, but it's a polymathic trait. You need to connect multiple dots, and it's something that you can help people develop the capacity. You can help people develop this capacity. So this is just my take on the subject so far, and obviously quite limited. But there you go.
So I like that. That's showing that if you have 18 answers and the 19th is necessary, the polymath goes, I say, into the mindset of I don't know. And I don't know how about you that functions in me. I find the answer very quickly if I go into the I don't know space. And then because I've learned so much and I know so many topics, then the answer, the 19th answer comes as well. So now I'm interested in John Flack. Oh, did I jump over Alan? I promised Alan. Alan, please, first, and then John.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what I'm about to say may be quite relevant as far as John is concerned. And what I've been trying to do right at the outset here was draw a distinction between abstract systems thinking and natural systems thinking. And basically, I come to as soon as I see that phrase requisite variety, what it basically means to me is needed variety. Why is variety needed? And in what context is variety needed? And I come to it as a biologist, an ecologist, an evolutionary ecologist. And once upon a time, I wrote this book, which is called Degrees of Freedom, subtitle Living in Dynamic Boundaries. And essentially, this entire book is about requisite variety, or why is variety needed? And that book was written before I understood natural inclusion properly, so it's a bit muddled. But even so, I was still thinking on these terms. And I wrote a few very, very quick notes before this. Okay, the question that's right at the heart of this is, from a biological point of view, from a living system point of view, from an organism's point of view, we are organisms. How can one attune receptively and responsively with a changeable environmental context? Just think about that question. How can one attune receptively and responsively with a changeable environmental context? Okay, and all of us as living organisms live in a changeable environmental context, and we're continually having to go through this process of trying to attune with change. I mean, I've been through a real shock in recent times, and that meant I had to attune very rapidly with very changed circumstances. And then so the basic answer to that is basically by being changeable oneself, whether as an individual or as a collective. Okay, so in a way, that's a statement of Ashby's law, yeah, but in a very sort of natural and ecological way. And it relates also to the idea of diversity in community. actual natural communities. How is it that we get a community of life involving a huge variety of different forms, somehow coherently producing an ecosystem, and all that we understand by an ecosystem? Then it takes us back into these interesting questions about how organisms can vary their phenotype in relation to circumstance. And that takes us into the areas of 3 levels of regulation, which are genetic, epigenetic, and something only I've ever talked about, which is hyper epigenetic, which is all to do with about boundary regulation. So it all comes back to that evolutionary principle that I keep telling you about, called natural inclusion, as the dynamic inclusion of variable form in constant space. That's one way of putting it. Okay, so the dynamic inclusion of variable form in constant space, understanding evolution not as bits and pieces in a computer map, but as a process, and a process which effectively involves a dynamic boundary which changes its properties in relation with its circumstances. And there are even ways in which I know how that works through oxidative metabolism. So there's a whole sort of, so that's what I was trying to draw your attention to, is the difference between looking at this as kind of as abstract system thinkers and as natural system thinkers. But all the while, this is where polymathy comes in, because polymathy is all about requisite variety, the variety that is needed to attune with continually changing context, which is evolution itself. So I tried to put that in a very sort of nutshell type way, and as best I can. But it's actually something I've given an enormous amount of thought to, and it's right at the heart of natural inclusionality.
And I love that Aaron and Alan are bringing those perspectives, because for me, I think it's more natural, but I wasn't distinguishing. So I said John comes next, but I see Said has his hand up. So I take Said and then John. Is that okay for you, John?
So thank you very much for this great conversation. A lot to say from even what the people have said here. We need to look at the variety within the variety. When you are 5-year-old, you will see an ant and you think there is one type of ant. When you look further, then you will find we have, I don't know how many we have, but perhaps hundreds of different types of ants. You are an adolescent and 15-year-old, you think there is one type of penguin. Where you look into it a little bit further, you go to the zoo or something. Oh, there are so many. So we have variety within variety. The word system, as what I looked at before, originally it meant the creation. Perhaps it has a religious connotation in the past, but originally it meant the creation. Before we came here to Earth, variety pre-existed, and perhaps it's going to exist after us. We have no choice but to deal with variety. So there is variety within variety to acknowledge, to discover. There is intra-variety, and it's complex, of course. But what is interesting is we have a variety of birds. You know, when you look at swarms and the migrations, it's amazing that they live in a variety, but they have to do migrations to live. We, as human beings within an organization, we don't have migrations. We still mapping, copy dummy, the structural political organization we have outside, and we bring it to the organization, and we have the haves, the think and the think nots, or the think too much or think too little. So we still don't know how to learn from nature. And basically, there is a lot to say about this, but the varieties we have inside organizations, they are cognitive, they are emotional, they are cultural, they are what have you. And we need to play with all those. And going back to what Aaron said, Aaron Van Kampen, you are always dealing with probabilities. But I want to add something to that. When you're dealing with probabilities, as the book White Lens shows, we are dealing with the multiplication of probabilities. So your success formula is not an addition of probabilities or uncertainty, it's a multiplication of them. And you know what happens when we multiply probabilities, right? And I stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Said. John, please.
Yeah, so this is something that I've been thinking about for more than 40 years. And 10 years ago, I would have been exactly where Aaron was. And in fact, I wrote a book on control theory and know the mathematics of control. And feedback systems is an example of coupling. But it's not a particularly good example because there's a lot of entailments that are not, that I think mislead us. So when people talk about feedback, generally what they think about is a sequence of trial and error actions. And it implies that you know where you want to go. So even the concept of error suggests that you know what the goal is. And nature doesn't know what the goal is. And so to me, the key, and what Alan said very early, is it's coupling. So it's circular dynamics, and feedback is an example of circular dynamics. And all of this applies to feedback systems. What it comes down to is the question of stability. What does it take for something to last? And not forever, but for long enough for somebody to notice it. So, and so it's
funny, I have heard Aaron talk about this question as well.
Yeah, and I mean, Aaron used the term viability. I think in terms of balance, but the thing is we tend to think about it in human terms. So we think about controlling and business and stuff, but it's the dynamics of circular systems. So, an example that Alan often uses is the river and the bank, right? There's no goal there. There's no, but there's gonna be a stable relationship that's achieved. And then sometimes conditions change. So the weather might change and stuff. And the current configuration of the river and the bank becomes unstable, and it's going to change. And it's going to end up somewhere. It's going to end up at the next stable place. It doesn't know where it's going. It's not a goal for it, but it's going to end up. And the same thing when we look at animals and survival, and we look at our own thing, we're here today because up until now we've done what it takes to last. And I don't know, for me, it's not because I knew where I wanted to go and I was able to correct the errors along the way. It's more like, I feel more like, kind of a leaf on a river and I've just kept upright, but where I ended up had a lot more to do with the river currents than any intention or choices that I made. But the thing that I think, and my whole career, and it's been frustrating, is people think in causal chains. And even when they draw the feedback system, they think about it as trial and error. I do something, I get error, and I correct it. No, that's not how the river and bank interact. There's no error. But yeah, again, so the key issue is stability. And you can't understand stability even in a simple feedback system by tracing signals around the loop, because it's a loop. There's no beginning, there's no place to start. And so stability is a property of the whole. And that's where I think, Alan, I'm not always understand. I'm not sure the words he uses all this. I quite understand the full intentionality, but I think he understands stability and he understands the dynamics of circles in ways that most of the world doesn't. And that's why I really like what he says, even though sometimes I don't quite understand the words, but I can always tell that we're talking about the same thing on the same track. Over.
So if I'm looking from a human perspective, and we have a lot of feedback mechanisms that are immediately reacting. And I would say one is presence and in the present. So if you're present in the present, then feedback is immediate, and then you can do wise actions. If you're going and just looking from hindsight, then you have all the problems that you talked about with those feedback loops that are drawn. And then yeah, it's that's the where the mess is coming from. Gary, please.
Yeah, by the way, I apologize for my craziness earlier. In line with this conversation, I was in my car, I have a new car, and I turned everything off, and the car kept on fighting with my phone, and it did not want to let me into a video call. And it turns out the safety system in the car is on 100% of the time, even if the engine's off. So ironically, it kind of fits with this discussion as far as, the best thinking got us here, and ended up. So anyway, I dashed back to my office. By the way, this is a fascinating conversation, and the level of expertise here, I'm just kind of soaking it in, listening to everybody. I see several things. Two broad categories: the sledgehammer approach and the adaptive approach. Now, evolution uses the sledgehammer approach. Give me 1 billion years and give me 1 billion births. And at any given time, most organisms only use about 2 to 3% of the genes that are actually in their genome. They're active. And so what evolution does is it's just constantly rolling the dice. And I find bacteria to be extremely intriguing. Okay, yeah, we'll do billions, and we'll do it in seconds instead of years. And because my background's pharmacology, and there's a constant battle with antibiotics because evolution uses a sledgehammer approach, and actually bacteria are probably the best at using that approach. Okay, the other approach is complex adaptive approach. And what happens is, one of the things I noticed in some of the conversation here is I felt it was too low in the hierarchy. And actually, because I was listening to the level of frustration and talking, and the thing is, there's a meta position that needs to be jumped to, and that's where we get into complex adaptive systems. Now, the example that comes to mind for me is my favorite American football team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, especially in the 70s when they won 4 Super Bowls in a row. And they interviewed the coach, and they said, well, what did you do? Why are they so great? The interviewers would always come in with a top-down approach. And all Chuck Noll said was, well, if you want the Super Bowl ring, go for it. Figure out how you're going to work together. So what the Steelers did was they had a feed-forward system from the bottom up. So they were not locked into circularity. What they focused on was, if any one player got a piece of information, no matter where it was on the field, they worked on field presence so that they essentially could communicate very rapidly with each other, and they would adapt. So where they drove the other teams nuts is they were in a feed-forward adaptive situation, and the other team would try to figure out, oh, what are their circular rules? They didn't have circular rules. And they just, and they didn't have all of the superstars in the league. That was another, in the United States, we're always after, who's the big dog. They didn't have big dogs. What they had was people that worked together. And what the coach realized was, with requisite variety, it's a bottom-up system, not a top-down system. And the people at the top need to display humility and vulnerability in terms of distributing the power to the people that are getting the most information. And now we get into egoless teams, because in egoless teams, we pass the talking stick to the person that's in touch with either the most vulnerable information, or in terms of return on investment, the most powerful information. And no, you never hold on to the talking stick. You just get it for where you can add to the group. And then okay, here's the other thing with requisite variety. Trust is huge, because what I'm saying is, when you want to take the talking stick from me, I trust you're going to have my best interest in mind, even though I don't know what you're thinking at the time. So I'm going to surrender to the new rule that you're bringing in. Now, the deal is when your rule exhausts, the talking stick goes to someone else who can adapt to whatever the new information is. So anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I don't know.
Very interesting. Thank you. Aaron?
Yeah, just first to react on John. He said something about nature has no goal, but John, I'm reading a lot of stuff now, and I find that the teleology of nature is really survival, adaptation, and emergence. So it must be a goal, isn't it? Nope.
No, not in the sense. So it ends up someplace,
Right. So
of course, but it only looks like a goal in hindsight.
But continuation of life, isn't it?
Is that a distinction between a goal for the system versus a goal for an individual?
No, it's not. So the way, at least what I hear you say when you say goal, is an intention.
But the teleology is a purpose-driven goal seeking, right?
Well, that's what the word means, but nature is not teleology. Nature doesn't have a goal. It doesn't have an intention.
Well, there is yes and no. There's scientists that say yes, they have, and maybe you say it's no. So it's really
no. Science doesn't. I don't think science is going to tell you that nature has an intention. That that I don't think the river has an intention. So the river isn't seeking a particular form. The form emerges from the coupling with its surrounds.
So the emergence effect, the emergence itself, 1 and 1 plus 1 and 1 is 3, could be in my view, an extra functionality that is, arising from the evolution that we all endure, right? That we all have. So we grow. I mean, life grows to a certain whatever.
Yeah. So, as things interact, they can move from one stable point to another, and with changes, some of the new stability points can be very different qualitatively than the prior. But it wasn't because it chose those qualities, it's because in order to be stable, it had to gain those qualities. And yeah, so there's lots of things I'd like to say also about Gary's thing, and I agree 100% with what he's saying, in the sense that in organizations, the ability to listen to people on your team, all of us have, none of us has the requisite variety, right? So requisite variety, for example, what I would argue is a aspirational goal. That is, the variety in nature is, in a sense, infinite. There's always changes coming, and we don't know, so we never have the requisite variety. But in a competitive environment, the organism with the greater variety is going to generally, in the long term, win competitions against an organism with lesser variety. That is, if a tennis player has a large arsenal of shots, and your opponent has less shots, then you're going to have a shot that he can't count. And eventually, in the long run, you're going to win more often, the player with the greatest variety. But it doesn't always have to be competition too. You can also, think about coupling in terms of a dance, and you could have someone really talented who has a lot of variety and can do lots of things, and you can have them dancing with someone who has low variety, who only has a few movements, but together they're going to be limited by if they want to stay in stable relationship, they're going to be constrained by the variety of the lesser partner.
I'm not agreeing with that one.
I see the requisite variety as information. I really think that information is information, matter, and energy are a trinity now to make things function. So the functionality depends on the quality and the quantity of information, i.e. requisite variety, maximalization, and the questioning of all the maximum number of questions. If we do this in oil process, I train people worldwide oil and gas process operations, and I really apply and teach that law of requisite variety very intensely, because it will then not focus them on regulations, and checklists, but on the collection of variety and information, and therefore they can control their systems much better.
So
may I ask what you really mean by information, Aaron?
Well, information about the process. For example, you have to do a job. You have to. Well, I'm in oil and gas loading and unloading operations worldwide. I train oil terminals, refineries, how to do that best. So I say, okay, what is needed?
You're thinking of information in terms of data?
Both data and information, which is just observation. Experience also counts, right? It's not like I'm collecting data. It's like also, do I have an experience? What is your experience from this incident? Everything is collected, and then we learn it, and then become a learning system.
And what does where does intuition come in?
Oh yeah, of course, we have to use all senses: intuition, imagination, feeling, and sensation. Like William Blake already told us, Alan, right?
I think we need to go beyond information. I like Ikojiro Nonaka, who goes through the evolving organization, going from information to knowledge and to wisdom. So even wisdom being distributed among workers. I want to connect with what Adam started with the phone calls in a support system. I worked for IBM PC support about 20 years ago, and I understand what he was talking about. We did specialization, so we have specialists, but also we had generalists. So we had specialists, generalists to handle all these phone calls that come from all kinds of people, from the housewife in PC to the super expert. But whatever we did with specialization and generalization did not work. So when the system was failing, the system was failing when information is not or the knowledge is not there. And going back to the Pittsburgh Steelers, how did we do it? Beyond generalization and specialization, it was the help, people helping each other. So we know my coworker is a specialist, but he needs help on this phone call. And we had this migration within of knowledge to help out. That's all I said. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something, John. You were talking about intentionality and that the universe doesn't have intentionality. I think that's true to a point. And the example I give, because I do organizational consulting, and one of the tricks that the Darth Vaders in organizations will use is they will work to lower the conversation to a level that doesn't allow, to pick up on what Sad was saying, it doesn't allow for the wisdom that the challenger is bringing to the situation. So what the Darth Vader does is they dumb down the conversation. And the way I expressed it to people, it's a little gruesome, but I said, you can cut that body up all you want, but you're never going to figure out what the guy's sense of humor is. And I think sometimes when people look at intentionality, they just drop down to a level where intentionality doesn't exist. I believe evolution occurs, and intentionality is an emergent behavior. And so I think the universe does have intentionality at some point. Not that every hydrogen molecule is deciding whether or not to mate with an oxygen molecule or whatever. But anyway.
Yeah.
Emergence.
I think intentionality is a necessary thing if you want to build causal narratives. And you won't understand what Alan's saying is if you're thinking in causal narratives.
No, but we have non-causality complexity, right?
I'm talking about complexity. I'm not talking about linear causality. No. I'm talking about complexity.
No.
But
I mean, just the one word flow will come in here is that when you're thinking in terms of flow processes, basically flow goes from high energy to low. So there's in the sense that, you know, that's what a river does, and it's ultimately to do with the relationship between electromagnetism and gravity and all these sorts of things which are right in deep physics, but the deep physics itself is up the creek because it is based on digital logic and not on flow logic. And that is, you know, that's why we've got these tremendous enigmas around in terms of trying to understand quantum mechanics in objective mechanistic terms, and you can't do so. You can understand quantum mechanics in terms of a receptive responsive relationship between energetic motion and receptive space. And right at the heart of so much is that when we think in terms that ignore the receptive presence of space everywhere, then essentially we end up with lots of bits and pieces because we've lost what it is that gives us natural continuity. So it's and really truly understanding natural spatial and dynamic continuity. Nature is continuous. It's not cut up into bits, but that doesn't mean, but continuous doesn't mean all the same. It is continually producing variety. And understanding how that process of the continual production of variety through a flow relationship between a receptive presence and a responsive presence, a circulatory presence and a spatial presence, actually helps us to understand material form itself and actually understand information in a different way, in the sense that information is the process of formation that gives rise to material form through a relationship between two intangible presences of energetic motion and receptive space. And it also has a huge mathematical implications, because as soon as we try to do maths that separates matter and space, we get into trouble. And essentially that's Boolean logic, that's computer logic, is essentially it's all based on a separation of space from matter, which in reality does not take place because matter itself is a product of a relationship between space and movement, stillness and movement. And the stillness, of course, is given on the one hand, giving the stability, and the movement is given the variety. And that manifests in a huge array of different evolutionary forms. Gosh, it's very hard to try and say all this in a few moments.
So we are at the
Can
thank
I
you
just
so
say,
much, Alan. This is really cool. So we are at the end of the hour,
Yeah.
and I would like everybody to just say one takeaway sentence, because we've discussed a lot, so that everybody can. John already has his hand up. He might have wanted to say something else, but John, what is your takeaway?
Well,
One
so
sentence.
yeah, I don't know how to put into words what Alan and I are trying to say, but there's an anecdote from Wheeler, the physicist. He tells a story of the surprise version of 20 questions. And in this game, so the game of 20 questions is you send somebody into the hallway and everybody in the room agrees on a word. And then that person comes back and they have to ask questions, yes, no questions, and they have to guess the word. So that's the normal way it's played. But Wheeler tells the story of, so he's sent into the hallway and he comes back into the room and he's out there for a long time. He can't figure out what's going on. And he comes back into the room and he just can sense something's funny going on. But he starts playing, he's asking questions, and he notices that it takes a long time for them to respond as he's going on, but eventually he gets in and he guesses a word. And then everybody starts laughing. And he said, okay, so what's so funny? And what they decided when he was out in the hallway is everybody would have their own word. However, the word that you had in mind had to be consistent with every response that he gave. So, for example, if you had elephant in mind and his first question was, is it an animal? and that person doesn't have an animal mind, says no, then you have to change what's in your mind. And Wheeler said, this is the nature of the coupling. This is the nature of flow. That is the idea that we classically think there's a fixed thing out there, a word that's already decided, and we think about life as trying to find that. But he says, no, actually, our actions, we're co-creating the word. The word emerges from the interactions. There is no fixed word out there that we're trying to find. But I think that's a kind of relationship that is very difficult for people to understand. But for me, that story from Wheeler, and he was using that to explain quantum mechanics and the strange aspects of quantum mechanics and Heisenberg uncertainty and the observer problems at the quantum level. But to me, I think it applies to life. And I think it is a metaphor that kind of captures what I think Alan is trying to communicate with the word flow.
Thank you. Aaron, your sentence, please.
Yeah. Just one question, one sentence only. Yeah. I'll keep it short. Okay, what I was thinking, I wanted to say something. Look, we have to, I think requisite variety information collection leads us to novelty. So I think that is the purpose. That is the goal. And that's just my final saying for this conversation.
Thank you. Alan, one sentence.
The one I said before, how can one attune, and I love the word attune, I don't like the word adapt. How can one attune receptively and responsively with a changeable environmental context? Just that sentence.
Wonderful.
There's a lot of depth in that sentence or in that question.
I will ponder about it, and it has music in it. That's why I love it.
Oh yeah,
Please.
yeah. Flow is all about music. Music's all about flow, and it's all about the relationship between still silence and noisy movement.
Harmony, right? Harmony, Alan.
Yeah.
I've been hearing a lot of metaphors, and the thing that keeps popping up is some variation on being careful about applying metaphors outside of their source domain and watching out for when they may mislead you.
Thank you. And I think it's done intentionally by some people. Said, please.
Just add to Alan's definition of sentence, changeable and testable.
Thank you. You're wonderfully short. Carlos, please, your takeaway sentence.
Okay, so I'm too bad at this game. I can't do this in a one takeaway sentence. So I'll do it just in one word. And it's just information. Why this word? Just because of the realization from Alan's words that it's not information, but information. There's a lot of concepts that have been debated around here that I wasn't familiar with. This one stuck probably because it was one of the last ones that was debated. And I would actually really appreciate rewatching the recording of this session, if it's possible.
Is anyone against sharing the session?
No, it's valuable.
Okay, then I will share it with the email group.
Valuable for the world.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for that.
Can I share it on LinkedIn?
I have that.
Okay, good. Gary, please, your last sentence.
The joy of being stretched. Thinking that I was open-minded, yumpty dumping through the day, but then as I listen, it's like, no, I've actually shut down more than I thought.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Sorry, Adam, I took the lead a bit about from you sometimes, but I couldn't. It was just a word game in the beginning with the chair, but you did a great job. Thank you so much for collective leadership.
Right. Thanks. All right, guys.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you very much, everyone.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Take it easy.
Ciao.